Continuing our reading in Abraham, Hannibal, and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox. Today is chapter 3. Soon the ship's whole story came out as the children sat at the Frank's feet in the dark cargo hold. "This is a French ship, the Star of the Sea," began the Frank, still sitting with one arm around each of his children. "We were sailing from the port of Marseilles in the south of France to Naples and then to Sicily. We had a cargo of cloth, china, and tapestries for Naples, and wheat and New World sugar and tobacco for Sicily. But I was on my way with my children to work as a merchant in Sicily, a merchant in wine. I am an Englishman, and I have worked as a merchant all my life in many different countries, in England, in France, in Italy, and in Egypt. My wife passed away in France 2 years ago, and so I am a father and mother to these 2 children of mine." He gave them each a squeeze and a smile. The Frankish boy and girl clearly couldn't understand what he was saying, but they smiled back up at him. To tell the truth, Abraham and especially Ngonga couldn't quite follow all of the Frank's story, since he kept mentioning strange places and things that they'd never heard of. "My daughter is called Elizabeth, and my son Andrew. They are Elizabeth and Andrew Robertson, since I am Mr. Robertson." Abraham practiced the names under his breath. Even in the gloom of the cargo hold, he was fascinated by the way the Robinsons looked. How strange! They're all 3 of them got blue eyes, and the children's hair is so yellow and so long. It all seems, well, a bit against nature and not ugly, just odd. Hey, they're staring back at me now. I wonder if Ngonga and I look just as strange to them. The Frank said something very fast to his children in their language, as if explaining what he'd been saying in Arabic. To carry on, we had unloaded our cargo in Naples and were sailing south along the coast towards Sicily when a huge storm blew up. We were driven right off course far out to sea and lost one of our masts and some of our sails. But at last the storm was over, and we found a galley rowing toward us in a much worse state than we were, in fact, looking about ready to sink. We let it come alongside, and the crew boarded us. And then it was that we realized they were pirates, the terrible pirates of the Barbary coast of Africa. Our cannons had been no use at all. We tried to fight them off, but our captain and half the crew were killed, and the rest of us found ourselves prisoners in our own cargo hold. "But what is going to happen to all of us?" asked Abraham. Mr. Robertson's face grew suddenly very serious. "I fear that we are being taken to the big slave market in Istanbul to be sold as slaves. The Turks always need more men to row their galleys for them, and they often capture Christians to be their galley slaves. I suppose, if my son is luckier, he might even be taken into the Sultan's palace as a page boy and rise to great things in the court, though still as a slave, mind, and he must give up his Christian faith. As for my daughter with her golden locks and white skin, I very much fear, she will be bought as a slave by some great man, who knows, even by the Sultan of Turkey himself." Mr. Robertson pressed his lips hard together, and in the darkness of the cargo hold, Abraham could see tears shining in the corners of his eyes. He had never seen a grown man weep before. "But I am hoping it won't come to that. I may be able to get a message to some business friends in France or England or Italy to send money to buy our freedom." "What about Ngonga and me?" Mr. Robertson shook his head. "House slaves, most likely. At least it's better than farm work. They don't treat their house slaves badly in Turkey, not the way our sugar colonies and tobacco colonies do. But how do 2 Africans happen to be here? What's your story? Why were you speaking in French of the king of the Franks and the emperor of Ethiopia, was it?" Abraham started off fast and excitedly. "Well, you see, the emperor of Ethiopia, that's our Emperor Jesus the Great, chose me and 9 other noble children to go with his Dr. Poncet on a mission to France. I am of the line of Solomon, king of the Jews. My father is Phares, the Lord of the Sea, a great man in my country. We are taking gifts and a message of friendship to the Sun King, King Louis of the Franks. That's why Dr. Poncet taught me some French. I've been practicing it ever since, so I won't forget. My sister Lahea, she wanted to come with me, so she tried to swim after our ship, and she drowned. In spite of himself, Abraham's voice began to crack, and he could feel the tears starting to come. Naganga and Mr. Robertson each took one of his hands, and the two Frankish children whispered something to their father. Mr. Robertson whispered back to them in their own language, and then said, I was telling my children what you were saying. They are very sad about your loss. Abraham smiled at them all and swallowed hard. It's all right. Anyway, we got as far as Arabia, but we were kidnapped by the king of Mecca and his desert raiders. Dr. Poncet wasn't, I never found out what happened to him. And I was sold to a Turkish merchant called Master Ahmet. Abraham shivered for a moment at the thought of that bony, wrinkled face, the cold, scornful look in his eyes, that whining voice forever nagging at him. Master Ahmet took me to Egypt and put me and lots of other slaves and goods on a ship. That's where I met Naganga. Of course, she isn't my sister as you thought, but she's like a sister now. Anyway, there was a huge storm and the ship was wrecked on this tiny island. We were the only two slaves who survived. We lived on the island for 37 days, I counted. I marked the days on a stick. Mr. Robertson looked startled and explained the story to his children. The children fired some questions at him and he laughed. We all want to know what you lived on for so long. Goat's milk and cheese. We made it ourselves. Luckily, there were lots of goats there. That's why we gave the island the name Goat Island. We built a hut too. And then your ship came and we thought we were safe. I saw the lily flower flag, and so I knew that this was a French ship with Christian sailors who would never take a Christian as a slave. I was sure it would take us to France, and I would achieve my mission to the Sun King after all, and show him that the youth of Ethiopia are second to none, just as my emperor asked me to. And now look where we are instead. For a terrible moment, as Abraham looked around his gloomy prison, he thought he might break down again, and Naganga caught his eye and said dryly, I told you that perhaps we go from the crocodile's teeth into the lion's claws, remember? Mr. Robertson was grim-faced, looking at the skinny boy in his torn and dirty undershorts. My boy, even if the Star of the Sea were still a Christian ship under a Christian captain, I wouldn't place too much hope in your reaching the French court. I believe every word you've told me, but many wouldn't. And there's many a Christian ship whose daily business is carrying slaves to a living death in the Americas. Abraham stared at him in disbelief. But I'm a Christian just like you Franks. Surely a Frank would never sell another Christian into slavery. Surely not. Well, they're more commonly they'll sell pagans or Muslims, but Frankish slave merchants will happily sell and buy any African they can lay their hands on, Christian or otherwise. Countless so-called Christians have this fearful stain on their souls. I'm sorry to say, let's hear your tale, Naganga. It's your turn. So Naganga told the story of her village, far, far away in the south, in the land of the black people, where the great river flows through a vast green swamp, and how she and her friends were out collecting firewood when slave raiders caught them and packed them on little boats and took them down the great river on a journey so terrible that two of her friends threw themselves into the water rather than endure it one more day. Then at last they reached the sea and Master Ahmet's ship, and her story and Abraham's became the same story, ending in this dark cargo hold. The last two pirates came down with water and flat dry bread for them all. And soon the dim light faded from the portholes, and they all stretched themselves on the hard floor to sleep. Abraham lay awake for a long time, listening to the steady breathing of the others around him, asleep. It was hard getting used to the rocking of the boat again after 37 days on dry land, and besides, his mind was racing. Here we are, then. We did escape to the Franks, just as I hoped we would, and they're no better off than we are. Every one of us a slave, and what's the Sun King going to do about it? But then the thought of his sister Lahea came to him. If you want something badly enough, and you don't give up wanting it, you'll get it in the end. That's what you always used to say, Lahea, isn't it? The Sun King isn't going to find me, so I'll just have to find him. I'll get a message to King Louis. I'll show him that the youth of Ethiopia is the best in the world for wisdom and courage and high breeding, just as our emperor said. And under his breath, but very firmly, Abraham repeated like a magic charm 2 of the sentences that the French doctor had taught him in Ethiopia. My name is Abraham, and my father is a noble lord of Africa. The emperor of Ethiopia sends brotherly greetings to the king of the Franks. And that's the end of chapter 4.